All right, hi everyone. Welcome to another edition of Community Connection in Times of Crisis. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for people to join. So if you'd like, please use the chat box to let us know that you're here, let us know where you're joining us from and what temperature it is where you are. We're just curious because we're here in Boston and it's cold and rainy and we need some sunshine in our lives. So we'll get started in just a moment. Please leave your microphones muted and your videos off for the time being, and I'll come back on in just a minute and we'll get started. Well, at least it's not just us where it's cold and rainy, but I'm glad to hear it's sunny in some places like Idaho and of course California with 85 degrees. I'm going to get started with just a couple of housekeeping items. If you've been on our webinar before, these will be familiar to you. So we do ask that you leave your microphone and your video off while the speakers are presenting. If you have any technical issues, you can email my colleague Caroline. She can help you troubleshoot. And if we're all having technical issues, we will switch to phone, and the phone number is on the screen. It should also be in your email, and we will email everyone if Zoom stops working. So far, we haven't had any issues. And just a reminder that all previous webinar recordings, as well as this one, will be on our website. If you go to cfleads.org and click on our resources page, you can find them all there. And I'll turn it over to Deborah to get us started.
Thank you, Melody. I'm having a few technical difficulties here today, so forgive me for holding my microphone right up to my face. But welcome to the 6th webinar in the CF Leads webinar series, Community Connections in Times of Crisis. As those of you who've been on this before know, this online forum is for community foundations who want to come together and hear how your community foundation colleagues are navigating the consequences of the coronavirus. We're really pleased that so many in the field are participating and finding these webinars valuable. And thank you to those of you who have reached out to express your appreciation and offered suggestions for additional topics. It really is gratifying to see so many community foundations looking to exercise your community leadership muscle so you can help your communities weather the immediate crisis, the recovery, and rebuild stronger. So despite the beautiful backdrop behind me of what I think is a pristine Brazilian beach, as many of you know, CF Leads is based in Boston, and we have been having a really tough week. Relatively small Massachusetts has nearly 3,500 deaths so far. And yesterday marked the highest single death toll of 252. So it has been really sobering for us. And the public health crisis is really very much with us. And I know others of you are experiencing things very similar and perhaps different. Perhaps it's a widespread outbreak at a local plant or at a local nursing home. So we're still in the thick of this public health crisis and, of course, the accompanying economic crisis. So it's easy to get caught up in all the bad news. So what I'd like to do today is just take some time to express appreciation and gratitude. While I have a lot to be personally grateful for, I really want to express my appreciation to community foundations and all you are doing. First, thank you for jumping in, for seeing this crisis as something you needed to help address. This time needs leaders, and you saw that your community foundation had a role, and you acted. At the same time, we see that you are engaged in unprecedented partnerships that we might not have seen a decade ago, and you've been building on those relationships that you have been growing over time. Second, I really want to thank you for all the listening that's going on to understand what is going on the ground so that you can be most helpful. And at the same time, really taking a few risks and being entrepreneurial. So while you're gathering the information that you need to make decisions, you're also acting quickly. And as we keep saying, there's clearly no playbook for where we are today, but it's just so inspiring to see the creativity and energy that you are bringing to the work and to see your willingness to adjust the rules to respond in this extraordinary time. And finally, thank you for focusing on those who have been most hurt and are experiencing the greatest pain and doing your best to address their challenges. You're focusing on healthcare workers, small businesses, the undocumented, homeless. They need the support of your voice. And as we've said, the inequities in our systems are painfully visible now, and we must build back better. So thank you for being there. Your work really, really does matter. So as you know, at each of our Community Connection webinars, we'll hear from colleagues around the country, from community foundations of all sizes, from all parts of the country, and from all different kinds of communities. We will facilitate questions and conversation as best we can with the technology. And as you know, we often ask you to turn on your microphone and your video to ask your question. And then we'll close out with a poem that we hope will bring you just a little bit of peace and solace in these demanding times. So on this webinar, we have the opportunity to hear from two incredible community foundation leaders. Marian, they're from community foundations that are just a little bit smaller than some of the other ones we've heard from. And they're from two very different communities, but they are proving that you don't have to have huge financial assets to be a big asset to your community right now. So Marian Kaanon is the president and CEO of the Stanislaus Community Foundation in California. Stanislaus County is in the heart of California in the Central Valley. It has about 540,000 people. Major industries are agriculture and transportation and warehousing. Very, very diverse population. And the foundation has been in existence since 2012, so fairly young. And during Marianne's tenure, they have focused on education, inclusive opportunity, and civic engagement. Marcella Tillett joined the Brooklyn Community Foundation not long ago in September 2019 as the Vice President of Programs and Partnerships, overseeing the foundation's strategic grant-making and community leadership programs. She previously served as Vice President for Project BEAT of Planned Parenthood in New York City, a unique HIV prevention, harm reduction, and access to care program. The Brooklyn Community Foundation is actually relatively young, also founded in 2009. And as you know, Brooklyn is also very diverse and changing very rapidly in this time. So I'm going to sign off and turn it over to Marianne.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Deborah. And I accidentally told Deborah we were initiated in 2012. I started at the Community Foundation in 2012. It actually has existed since 2002. And we do serve sort of a suburban rural community of about 540,000 people. So as this crisis was breaking, I want to take you back to mid-March. We have one of our signature initiatives related to education is our Cradle to Career partnership. And we had planned a 400-person convening that we'd spent almost a year preparing for, in addition to all of our work related to Cradle to Career, but this was our big summit. was going to happen Friday, March 13th. All the vendors had been paid. We had 400 people showing up, and we pulled the plug on the event that Tuesday, 3 days before. And at the time, an op-ed in our local paper appeared that said the Community Foundation are being alarmists. And by that Friday, they rescinded the op-ed and actually said they were very smart in canceling. So what happened right away actually also is we understood, as we were beginning to read the headlines, that we were facing a very uncertain scenario. Our schools were beginning to close. California, as some of you know that are in California, is one of the first to issue a shelter in place in the Bay Area. We're about an hour and a half away from the Bay Area. We knew something was starting to emerge that was going to be very disruptive. So on Thursday, March 12th, we immediately sent out a survey to all of our nonprofits to really just get a sense, are they prepared? What is it they're needing? And we also have to put this in context of our community. We're not a philanthropically resourced community. We have very generous community members. We don't have organized philanthropy other than the Community Foundation and the United Way. So we knew that we would bear the onus of really moving through this crisis, not just supporting our nonprofits, but our Community Foundation has always sensed and named ourselves and is seen by a lot of people in this community as the vision keepers. What does it mean to be a vision keeper? It means to hold a long-term lens on our community. It also means that we have uncomfortable conversations, but the long-term vision is that we build a vibrant community. And all of our leadership work reflects that, a more inclusive and just community. So this crisis certainly has exposed a lot of the disparities, as Deborah mentioned, but we don't want to go back to the way things were. This is our opportunity to really disrupt our systems and be also what we call trusted disruptors. We speak to power in a way that power can hear it, and also start to move things in our community. And we've certainly done that in the last 5 years, but we see a real now, a critical mass happening, if you will. People understand the inequity is staring them in the face. It's not okay in 2020 America, not, to have people lined up blocks to get boxes of food. And it was usually invisible that we were feeding so many kids in our school systems. To now see it rendered visible is a really powerful moment that all of us need to lean into. So I just want to say I just got on the soapbox for a sec. I hope you'll indulge me with that. But how we responded early on is we issued the nonprofit survey and immediately turned around within 24 hours, analyzed the findings, and realized money is not going to just get us out of the situation, especially being in a philanthropically undersourced community. We have to get really strategic about how we're going to respond, not just with funding, because it is a bit like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. So we understood that the uncertainty of it, the long game, this was going to be an emergent thing. It was going to be fluid and people are going to be in flux. We realized, and we knew nonprofits because we surveyed them and we published reports in the past, but certainly in that moment when we surveyed them, we realized, a lot of them don't have operating reserves. They're going to have to lay off staff. A lot of them have declining revenue because they're fee-for-service models in schools that were closing. They're canceling. This is our big fundraising event season, as it is for many of you. So they were canceling things. So we immediately set out op-ed and also communicate to all of our donors, this is the time to actually step into giving. But that was just to frame the issue. So I will tell you, this is the thing we did that I think shocked some of my Community Foundation colleagues. We did not set up a disaster relief fund. Given the context of what I just told you, we didn't feel that it was the right time, and we also didn't think we would actually raise a lot of money. What we did do is position United Way, which are incredible partners to us. Our Community Foundation and the United Way here work very closely together. We actually fund some of their initiatives around homelessness, but we wanted them to step up and really be the disaster relief fund, and they did. They stepped up. They have the texting platform. They have the ability to really communicate to residents, and we supported that. We communicated all of their fund setup. So they've really been positioned to take the lead on disaster relief for immediate and vulnerable populations, that kind of response. We also, a lot of our donors contributed into that fund, but also we didn't want to create the fund and go through any sort of decision-making process. When we issued that framing of what these nonprofits were facing, our donors started, grant making. So we issued hundreds of thousands of dollars in funds to food banks and all the things you all are funding as well. But we did not set up our own fund right away. So I'll explain what we ended up doing. But what we really pivoted to do in the early days and what we've stood by is, we're known as the conveners also. We convene around sort of larger scale issues. We pivoted to be coordinators, to coordinate, communicate, and collaborate. So we coordinated immediately all the nonprofits that were interested and the faith sector to get on a weekly call. Initially it was daily, with our Office of Emergency Services, given the fluidity. And you guys, I'll tell you what, we're not used to working with the faith sector here at the Community Foundation. Wow, they were agile and nimble, and we immediately set up 2 different platforms with our faith sector partners. One was called loveourneighbors.org, and it's sort of the one-off requests that people had, that seniors had that were homebound or others, as the crisis was really starting to build, and people could volunteer in a way that was safe to do so. But this whole thing was vetted on this beautiful platform called loveourneighbors.org. I encourage you to check that out. Hundreds of people have asked for help, and hundreds of people have offered help, which is just this matchmaking service that we did that's hyper local. And then we also set up Love Our Schools, which is a part of our Cradle to Career work, but it was again a response for retired teachers to help parents coach their kids through some of the schooling. So those were sort of the early responses, helping United Way, coordinating the calls with the Office of Emergency Services and our faith sector partners, setting up platforms that were sort of agile and nimble and responsive to what was happening. And then we really also began to move into, as we began to understand the impact on small business, we then were in a position to open a fund. And just in the last 2 weeks, we've set up a resilient Stanislaus fund. So United Way is really positioned to do the disaster relief. We're as people are asking about that, United Way is in that mode. And we really are here for midterm and longer term economic recovery and focused on economic mobility and economic opportunities. So again, given that we knew all giving would be hyper local, all the communities are hurting at the same time, and within our community we're philanthropically undersourced, and you add the lens that all the nonprofits were going to be struggling all at the same time, we just had to get really strategic. We're also helping United Way with their grant making. We have calls weekly, and we've set up an online nonprofit survey tool that's live, that's constantly, we ask nonprofits, just keep us updated. You can update this as often as you want. It's very simple. If they don't have to always update it, but it gives us a bird's eye view on what their specific needs are. And we send out like a weekly nudge with resources. Again, that's our communication. We also early on decided all of our social media platforms were going to be hyper local information, very practical information. We weren't going to be like overly inspirational on our social media. People are getting that elsewhere. We were here to provide practical information on local issues that were happening and breaking. We also have sort of stepped into that collaborate role with our business community. So they really were looking for emergency relief grants while people were waiting for their federal stimulus bills. So we helped set up a grant fund and funded the county to match some of their dollars to provide immediate relief to small businesses that couldn't access federal stimulus dollars or hadn't yet received those federal stimulus dollars. We also provided technical assistance funding to several intermediary nonprofits that really have the ability to move nonprofits through their stimulus funding. As you know, a lot of nonprofits can't access that type of navigation through the SBDC. So we identified the right nonprofit and funded them so they could provide that technical assistance. So those are some of the things that we just, again, moved into. And it took every ounce of my being not to set up that disaster fund, you guys. It was really hard to say, no, United Way, you guys take the lead on that. We're going to pause, listen, observe, and then respond. And again, we were doing a lot, as I just named sort of the tip of the iceberg. We were doing a lot, but it wasn't just sort of like, let's create a fund and send out grants. And we were doing that too through our donors, but not through our own discretionary fund, So that was really hard. But I think it was the right thing to do. And I think it was, for our community, it made a lot of sense. It was the smart and strategic thing to do. So someone's asked me if I can expand on the Love Our Teachers. It definitely, we basically put out a call to retired teachers, and people are signing up, and they do video, Zoom calls, but there's a lot of caveats. So check out the website. The parent has to be on the video too with the kid and things like that. It's a great way for student teachers to get credits too. So we're working with our County Office of Education so that a lot of these student teachers can't get sort of, progress in their teaching. So we're trying to figure out if this online work can help them. So I know I'm done with my talk. I know we can answer questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. And I realize, even though I asked you, I introduced you as Marianne Kaanon, it's Marianne Kaanon. Thanks for correcting me originally. And so now we will hear from Marcella. And yes, Marianne, we'll get to these questions in the question and answer time. But feel free to type any questions into the chat box, and we'll get to it after we hear from Marcella.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you to CF Leads for inviting me to talk about Brooklyn Community Foundation's work and our Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund. As mentioned, my name is Marcella Tillett. I'm the Vice President for Programs and Partnerships at Brooklyn Community Foundation. We are the first and only public foundation solely dedicated to Brooklyn. We really focus on connecting donors and community leaders and nonprofits to make sure that we are strengthening Brooklyn neighborhoods and really leaning into the leadership and the expertise that exists within those neighborhoods. We have existed since 2009. We've distributed over $40 million in grants to more than 300 nonprofits. Very proud of that. We do our work centering racial equity and justice. And as I go through our different funds and the approach we take to our work, I'll give some examples of what that looks like. But essentially, it is understanding and really emphasizing the power and leadership that exists in neighborhoods and communities that have been traditionally undervalued, under-resourced, marginalized, and oppressed. So we really look to our Black and Brown communities, our immigrant communities, our different neighborhoods in Brooklyn for their leadership and look for those opportunities to share power and where the leadership is really coming from the constituency. We take an approach that's multi-pronged to our programming and partnerships work. We approach grant making, capacity building support and technical assistance, and advocacy. And we really see that as three key ways we can show up as a responsible partner in our role as a community foundation. In our Brooklyn Community Response Fund, which we created and launched March 13th, we have taken all of these ideas and values that we have as a foundation and replicated those in this new fund, which again, I'll talk about in just a moment. But the real crux of the creation of the fund was an understanding that there are going to be immediate needs, but far-reaching impact and a really long leash that we needed to be aware of, and understanding what needs were going to emerge over the next months and years as a result of the pandemic. And of course, leading with a community-informed approach. Can you move to the next slide, please? So I want to take us back for a moment to 2012. When we considered what was coming to Brooklyn in early to mid-February, we were paying attention to how coronavirus was spreading across the world and what was likely to be in store for New York City. We looked back to the Brooklyn Response Fund that we created in response to Superstorm Sandy, which hit New York City in November of 2012. We were able to create this fund less than a week after the storm hit. Brooklyn, much of Brooklyn is coastal. We have a lot of coastal communities in Brooklyn, and many of them were just devastated. We were able to build this fund. We deployed $3.5 million starting in November of 2012 through January of 2014. We started with seed funding from the foundation of $100,000, and then were able to do robust fundraising on top of that. That fund also took these three different approaches in terms of grant making, capacity building, and partnership, and advocacy. So in terms of the grant making, and these were some of the lessons learned from the fund that we have now carried into this current fund. We were able to fast track grants of up to $10,000 to frontline CBOs. We did a lot of outreach through phone calls and emails to organizations that we knew were active in the areas that were hardest hit. And also we wanted to connect with individuals and small businesses to make sure that the distribution of supplies and the support around cleanup and cash assistance were really going to the areas that needed it most. In terms of the capacity building support that we provided with an eye towards the long-term recovery, we knew that a collaborative approach in these hardest hit coastal neighborhoods would be key. So we were able to help create and support 6 community collaboratives in those coastal areas. And the work that they did was able to inform an advocacy strategy that was able to elevate the voices of those community members through the development of policy and advocacy priorities and recommendations to state, city, and federal government partners. And we, again, when we look at advocacy, we think about external advocacy around institutions and structures and policies and laws, and we direct that towards government. But as a philanthropic entity, we also see a lot of advocacy need within our own sector. So having conversations like these and writing articles and doing interviews around our approach and understanding that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to encourage other philanthropic organizations and foundations to center community voices, to advocate on the behalf of their nonprofit partners, amplify the expertise of communities of color, and really show what that looks like through our own work. And again, our community engagement and community accountability approach is at the cornerstone of this fund through the community collaboratives and carried through a project we had in 2014 called Brooklyn Insights, where we spoke to over 1,000 community members to inform the strategic plan for the foundation, which we are still functioning under today. To talk a little bit about our Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund, again, taking that multi-pronged approach, we have been able to provide grant making in our immediate response grant phase under, I won't read them. Actually, can you move forward? Sorry, next slide. Thank you. I won't read all of these topic areas, but these have been the areas of focus under which we've distributed 106 grants in the past 6 weeks to Brooklyn-based and Brooklyn-serving nonprofits doing incredible work. Again, we focus on providing support and grant making to organizations that has leadership and programming and decision making that's reflective of the community served and the client's constituency. And we're really proud of that being a cornerstone of the approach to our grant making. I'll give a couple of examples of some of the grants we've been able to make in our immediate response fund, immediate response grant making phase. They've included organizations such as Community Food Advocates, which is doing advocacy directed towards the New York City Department of Education's food distribution program to make sure that it's scaled effectively, ensuring that all areas get the proper support and the family needs are taken into consideration, and making recommendations based on that. We have another organization called Ladies of Hope Ministries, providing stipends and food delivery for women recently released from Rikers and New York State prisons. We have an amazing media organization called Documented that's providing Spanish language reporting on the specific impacts of COVID-19 on immigrant communities, Spanish-speaking immigrant communities here in Brooklyn. We also are funding another organization that has had to move their pro se immigration clinic to functioning fully online because of stay-at-home orders or social distancing orders. And that's New Sanctuary Coalition. So we've been really impressed to see all of the innovative ways that people and our nonprofit leaders have come up with very quickly to continue to provide critical services and provide new services based on emerging needs related to COVID-19. When we started this fund, we reached out in mid-February to several different community leaders to ask about the emerging needs that they were seeing in their communities. And we left space for those emerging needs, and it expanded to these, over a dozen focus areas. And we were really able to hear from our leaders, what were the needs, how are they responding, and show up as a partner with them, taking the lead on really shaping what this fund looked like. Next slides, please. So our grant making is taking several different forms. So the immediate response grants are $10,000 grants that we've been granting on a weekly basis. It's a rolling application. We've done, again, 106 grants so far. All of those grantees are also receiving matching grants as we move towards next week's Giving Tuesday Now day, which is next week, we are doing a Brooklyn Gives Now campaign. And these grantees will get a matching grant to help kickstart their fundraising and hopefully expand their network of funders. We awarded sustainability enhancement grants to our current grantees, which was not something they needed to apply for. We really wanted to keep the burden of even emails, RFPs, updates, any of that very, very low for our current grantees. So what we did was looked at a combination of factors, and based on the size of their budget, their leadership makeup, demographic makeup, the size of their board, their typical fundraising, we came up with a percentage of an enhancement that we would give them. And we sent them a new grant agreement and just sent them the money because we know they're doing critical work that was needed before COVID-19, during and after, and it needs that enhanced support to get through it. In terms of the additional support we're making towards our grant-making grantees, we're providing early payments, so we're granting those requests. We're delaying reporting and support visits. We're not doing any RFPs outside of the COVID-19 response fund. We're providing a 1-year grant extension for our multi-year grantees that are on the last year of their grant and some of our single-year grantees. And we are preparing for our sustained response phase, which will come next. But we are going to undergo a community engagement process, which we are designing now, to inform what that next phase is going to look like. Next slide, please, and I'll just wrap up. So our capacity building support has looked a couple of different ways. Resource sharing, our website, we have created a whole page that is specific to the needs of nonprofits, not just health information or other information, but what do nonprofits need to know in order to work from home, in order to get the supplies and support they need to stay running, in order to access the technical assistance they need. So that's one aspect. The Brooklyn Gives Now platform, we've created a fundraising platform that is free of charge to all Brooklyn nonprofits and Brooklyn serving nonprofits to help support their fundraising. We are doing capacity building webinars. We have a series that are focused on different topics that are coming directly from our grantees. So we had a session on understanding PPP and guidance to navigate the application process, as well as the forgiveness process. We partnered with Sea Change on making tough decisions, which really was targeted to board directors and EDs who are going to have to consider things like partnerships, mergers, the future sustainability of their organizations. Fundraising during a crisis, we're having that webinar next week for grantees, and we'll continue with additional topics such as financial scenario planning and other risk management topics. In terms of advocacy, again, the internal philanthropic sector advocacy we're continuing to do, and we're partnering and participating in broader nonprofit coalition advocacy taking place that's been really well organized in New York City. We have been following the lead of Nonprofit New York, our local Council on Nonprofits affiliate that's been doing incredible leadership work. So we're supporting that work, and we are also keeping our eye towards emerging needs and understanding that there's going to be a long-term requirement for us to show up in an advocacy role. With that, I'm going to close, and I went a little over time, but I'm happy to answer questions in the next session, and also direct you to the website for further information.
Thank you, Marcella, and thank you, Marianne. And Marianne, if you want to put your video and audio on, that'd be great, or at least video. So you can either raise your hand in the participant box, or you can just type your questions into the chat box. We do have a few questions. First, Susie Nelson, if you would like to turn on your audio and your video if you'd like to ask about the Love Our Teachers program.
Hi, yes, as a parent.
And Susie, tell us where you're from.
Oh, sorry, I'm from Wheeling, West Virginia, Community Foundation for the Ohio Valley.
Welcome.
And my ears definitely perked up when I heard you talk about the Love Our Schools initiative. as a parent of a 5th grader, I'm about done with the at-home teaching. So I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on that program.
Yeah, so we have a longstanding partnership with our County Office of Ed. So we did this knowing, with a lot of conversation with our County Office of Ed and our K-12 districts. There was a period of time where schools were, shutting down, but they had not yet deployed distance learning. They were trying to figure out what that is. And just to be honest with you, behind the scenes, there was a lot of wrangling with the teachers unions and necessarily so, to try to figure out how they're going to deliver distance learning. So there was probably 3 weeks to 4 or 5 weeks of dead space, really quiet space. And, some were doing some things, but it was very divergent across the board. We have 25 K-12 districts. So again, we saw a real need, and the faith sector stepped in to organize. There's this Love Our Cities nonprofit that really has a day of service every year, and other acts of service. And then they have these platforms. Love Our Schools was something they had developed and never really launched. And so in conversations with our K-12 districts, we realized, gosh, this could be something, again, volunteer driven, a call for retired teachers to go online, talk about the things they can do, what grades they can, what grades do they teach. And it isn't like formal schooling. It's really coaching the parent oftentimes, and even just providing some feedback to the students. So it's not like formal education, it's sort of more coaching. And it's both for the parent and then a little bit for the kids too. All free, and we provided a grant for them to get that going, just like we provided a grant for Love Our Neighbors. I will tell you, to Marcella's point, and someone asked about this, we also have set up a Media Lab fund. We fund several reporters for Report for America. Check out that nonprofit. It's a national nonprofit. It's like Teach for America, and they provide half the funds if you can find the local match dollars. So we now are funding reporters at our local paper focused on economic mobility and educational disparities and healthcare disparities in our community. And it's solution-based journalism. We have no say in what they cover. We're funding RFA to turn around as match funds to fund a full-time reporter. And they place the reporters. So I just wanted to put that out there. I know Marcella mentioned it too.
Great, thank you. And from Sandy Vidal, do you want to ask your question about not-for-profits and maybe their need to shift business model? If you can unmute yourself. Hi, Sandy, tell us where you're from.
Hello. I'm from Orlando, Florida, from the Central Florida Foundation. And I was just wondering, since you guys are pretty innovative in the approaches that you're taking, just looking at the nonprofits in the community, I've heard a lot of our nonprofits having to shift their business models. So for example, doing virtual tours for their nonprofit rather than in-person tours, changing their fundraising to virtual fundraising or other types of fundraising efforts, and then looking at our food banks, adding home delivery and things like that. So I was wondering if you had heard of any innovative ideas from your nonprofits and whether or not you were funding those types of innovation, because we're looking at, as we continue to shift the way that we're doing business right now, how to deploy some of our community investment dollars to help the nonprofits to make the shifts that they're having to make.
And Sandy, that's a great question. And there have been other speakers who have dealt with this too. I'm sure we'll have great responses from this, but Stu Comstock-Gay from Delaware in a previous webinar, and Eric Jolly from St. Paul, but I'm sure Marian and Marcella will have some great advice as well.
Yeah, we followed up with Stu and talked to him
Great.
a lot about mergers
Great.
and acquisitions.
Great.
Yeah, so I can give a few examples. We've been really impressed to see how quickly a lot of our nonprofit partners have pivoted. So something similar to what you mentioned, one of our grantees, Campaign Against Hunger, very quickly developed an online portal where people can place orders for their pantry. And then that would be connected to either home delivery if they were homebound or curbside pickup. And this was back in the 3rd week of March. They were able to quickly make this shift and continue to deliver services. We've also seen and been able to fund several organizations that are either providing some type of healthcare or healthcare support services that have been able to transition to telehealth in different ways and rely more heavily on phone and online online platforms to connect with their clients and patients. And for many of them, what we heard was that, this was something on the wish list, this is something that they wanted to do, and now it was something that they had to do. So to be able to show up as a partner to fund something that they were already thinking about, it was already in the pipeline, they just needed to kind of prioritize it and get it going and have some funding for the technology. That was really great. So those are a couple of examples of what we've seen locally. The other thing I will say is I think are some budding conversations as we think and look towards sustainability. If we look back to 2008 and the impact of the recession then and how many of our nonprofits closed, I think people are feeling that same pressure, they're feeling that same concern, and to be prepared for that, I do know that there have been conversations about more like intense partnerships, mergers, collaborations in different ways to ensure that the role that they were serving and are serving in their communities can be sustained.
I'll add to that a little bit that we are doing several things. We're getting ready to prepare webinars. A lot of nonprofits weren't in the space to really think about long-term. I mean, when you think about the consciousness of sort of how uncertain everything is, we didn't want to step out ahead of anybody, but we did immediately in the first week offer a webinar on how to do a remote office, how to set that up. And we had about 35 nonprofits join, and we interviewed our local IT company, and the IT company was amazing, provided a ton of free resources and tools and platforms. Obviously, there's the webinars. That's not the same as technical assistance in the form of one-on-one navigation, and that's the intermediary organization I mentioned that we're funding. And then the other thing we're doing that we're thinking about, to Marcella's point, we know some of these nonprofits, especially our performing arts organizations and our youth serving organizations, they're not necessarily getting the funding that our basic needs and shelter organizations are getting. And we all get sort of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs right now, but those are incredibly important organizations to the life and vitality of our youth and our communities. And so we're beginning to think about, and in full partnership with them, thinking about how can we be, that's that live survey link that I have on our website too. How can we be of use? When are you going to be ready? Basically, we're going to ask them for a deeper conversation. When do you have the bandwidth to do that, so that we're not forcing it on them, but really provide, I think the community foundations can really play a role in providing the consultancy, and consultants for that, or subject matter experts. So that's the other thing we're going to do. And then we had already planned in September to launch a social enterprise accelerator to have nonprofits that are interested to revamp their business model so that there's a social enterprise component. We live in a community with no social enterprise. It's a foreign concept in Stanislaus County. So we're getting ready to introduce that and run them through an 8-week cohort for up to 8 nonprofits, and then have them at the end develop their business line, whether it's a service or a product. And then we would have a fund, a group of donors that want to fund the prototypes that come out of that social enterprise cohort. So we were getting ready to do that, and we're not backing away from that. We think the timing is actually good. It may not be exactly in September. Again, we're going to assess for it, but we already have the program developed.
Thank you. Sandy Scarnelli, did you want to ask your question about the local media grant? I think it was probably for Marcella. So Sandy Scarnelli, if you're there, you can take put your audio on.
You may have answered it, but it just
wondered.
Local media grants, but is that to do the translation, or was there something else? I know there's a lot of smaller newspapers that are struggling right now as well because of the loss in advertising. And so I was wondering if you're doing something to support those community newspapers.
Yeah, so we have a couple of grants that are for newspapers or news outlets. So one that I mentioned before is an organization called Documented. It's a nonprofit news media outlet, mostly online. They also, from the beginning, started doing really, I think this is just so brilliant, because their kind of focus area, both in their readership and in the topics of their articles and their coverage is on the undocumented and immigrant community in Brooklyn. And so they have an online platform where you can get the news, but they also send out news alerts through WhatsApp. And they engage a lot of people and give them access to their news coverage via WhatsApp. So we're funding them to do Spanish language reporting specifically on COVID-19 impact on immigrant communities in Brooklyn, because that naturally is embedded in their focus area and their expertise already. Another newspaper, which is more of a, they have an online presence, but they also are known for their actual paper, physical newspaper. It's called Brooklyn Reader. It's distributed in a lot of communities of color in central Brooklyn. So as we think about all of the misinformation that's proliferating our everything in this country, we want to make sure that the sources of information that people have traditionally gone to, that they trust, that we can support them. And they're just critical deliverers of accurate information right now that people need, particularly as the guidance on COVID-19 in New York State and around the country has changed from day to day. It's very confusing. So that's another reason we prioritize newspapers and media in that way.
Thank you, Marcella.
Thank you.
Marianne, did you have anything to add from your perspective? Okay. Something to add?
No, I'm good.
You're good. Okay.
I put the RFA information in the chat box.
Great, great. Marcella, you mentioned the 6 collaboratives that were so important after Hurricane Sandy. Are you tapping into those again? And if so, what are they doing?
So those collaboratives have transformed in different ways, and some still exist. For example, one in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Red Hook has transformed, but it started as this collaborative. We continue to maintain contact with them. We are going to tap into that organization as well as our other network of nonprofits throughout Brooklyn as we lean towards this community engagement process that we are designing to guide us from our immediate response phase to our sustained response phase. Community engagement, the way we've done it, has been through community gatherings, face-to-face, in community settings. We, in our
Not doing a lot of that right now.
Exactly. In our insights process in 2014, it was over 1,000 Brooklynites in these small gathering settings all across the borough. We can't do that now. So in the design of what this looks like, we really have to take into account, how do we get that community voice? How do we connect with people, knowing that their initial need is not, okay, let me tap into my community foundation and tell them how to best meet my needs. It's really in meeting those day-to-day basic things they need to get through the day. So we're doing some work on it. And I think to your point earlier in the intro, we don't know. There's a lot of things that we just don't know. We don't know what to do. So we are leaning in with our nonprofit partners and trying to figure out what is the best we can do right now, and move forward and learn more as we continue to move forward. But we've been pushed into, I think, a very useful space of humility to listen. And we just are trying our best at this point.
It's interesting you say this. We're hoping to hear from a couple people who were involved in Katrina and rebuilding down there. And they went through a couple false starts with their rebuilding. And where they landed was on a very deep community building and process that was very much hearing from community and what they wanted. And that is ultimately where they landed, very similar to what you're talking about.
Can I add to the word Marcella just used, is humility?
Yeah.
I think we're seeing a real lack of that at sort of different levels of our government right now. And so I actually read something at 3 a.m. last night, because I'm having a hard time sleeping these days, as I'm sure a lot of you are too. And they talked about in a pandemic, I just want to read this line. It really kind of jumped out at me in this article. They're talking about the epidemiology of this, the public health aspects of this. But they said, in a pandemic, the strongest attractor of trust should not be confidence, but the recognition of one's limits, the tendency to point at expertise beyond one's own, and the willingness to work as part of a whole. And I think we're looking for and need and are thirsting for leadership that's vulnerable and humble and flexible. And I think community foundations, as you know well, Deborah, and as Marcella is showing us, and all of you on this call, that's the kind of leadership. It's the leadership that takes the middle path. This country sorely needs middle path leadership now more than ever. And that requires real humility. So I wanted to say that. And I know sometimes funders aren't perceived as being humble, but I think community foundations especially, to me, display great humility.
Well, and part of that, as you say, is this willingness to listen. That people have asked if you might share the article where that was quoted.
Sure, I took a screenshot of it. So it was 3 a.m. in the morning, but it was in the Atlantic, and I will find it, and yeah, I will share it. Yeah.
And sometimes that can be the most important thing you can enter the room with, is the ability to ask questions and draw out questions. Marian, what did your board say to your desire not to set up a relief fund?
So they actually agreed because they know this community well, and they knew that we didn't want to compete with the United Way. We knew resources would be scarce. We knew all giving would be hyper local. You know, there wasn't going to be other funds coming in from outside our community at any great, amount necessarily, especially in the early days. We're starting to see some of that, corporations giving and being sort of equitable about recognizing that in California, the inland region is very philanthropically undersourced and looks very different than the coastal metro regions with much bigger foundations and per capita giving. So the board was on board. I mean, they recognized that we don't want to compete for scarce resources. We don't want to make it harder for these nonprofits to access the funding. And let's stand up, two separate structures here, one for the short-term immediate relief, United Way's position to do that, and one for sort of the longer-term efforts. So our board was fully engaged and understood that.
And did you already have a relationship with your emergency management services that you could draw on?
We do, yeah. I called the county CEO directly and said, hey, you guys are getting siloed real quick because it's crisis. And in a crisis, you see these systems that we work with. And our community foundation, so I will tell you, we kind of orient more to our large public systems, because what I always say about our systems is they have scale and we have agility. And when you marry those two things together in a relationship that's based on trust, and we can do some really cool things at scale. Our nonprofits, we work with and we fund, and we do a lot of leadership work with as well. But we tend to orient to our large public education systems and shelter systems and service systems. So we have a long-standing relationship with our county and with our cities. And so, yeah, it was a call to say, look, you guys are in crisis command mode. There's a whole role that the faith sector and the nonprofits can play that's crucial. Can we just set up a call, an hour, and they said, okay, let's do it every day. And we did it every day for the first 2 weeks. Then we moved to 3 times a week. Now we're doing it twice a week on Mondays and Fridays. And yeah.
As this evolves, I'm sure that was a really helpful role for you to be playing.
Yeah.
Marcella, one of the things you told us as we were talking with you earlier is about your census work and how some of this has informed your work on the Get Out the Count. Can you talk just a little bit about that and how it's changing?
Yeah, so in 2018, Brooklyn Community Foundation partnered with the Brooklyn Borough President's Office to create the Brooklyn Complete Count Committee. Brooklyn has been one of the most undercounted areas. We have a lot of undercounted census tracts in Kings County, which is where Brooklyn is. So we knew this was a top priority for not only distribution of government resources, but redistricting and everything as we look towards past 2020. So in building that partnership in the Complete Count Committee and working with our county leadership, we were able to create a network and help to host a network of organizations focused on census. Unfortunately, I think the organizations that had already embedded census into their work, that work continues, and as they pivot their delivery of services, the census work that they've integrated has pivoted with it. In New York State, there was a promise of $20 million to be distributed to counties throughout the state. And that was to be distributed in mid-March. As you might imagine, that was put on hold. So a lot of the organizations that were primed to respond to census in the push in the lead up to Census Day were halted. They were closed. The resources they thought were coming did not flow. So we've been put in a real dire situation here. And as we see the response rates in real time, again, what we expected to happen is happening. Brooklyn is being undercounted. And as people in different parts of the country leave their homes in different ways, Brooklyn is still very much in a state of emergency, and we are sheltering for our own safety and for the sake of public health. So there's a lot of concern when it comes to how that's going to impact our count for the census. And that's something that we haven't really figured out yet, but we're continuing to support the organizations that have been able to do some of that work.
Great.
There's a lot more that needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. This is really, really rich, and we always really want to thank those of you who participate, as if you have an hour in your day for anything other than being directly focused on your community. So thank you very, very much. I want to tell all of you who are listening that, as I mentioned, we are going to go to offering this webinar every other week. We'll have a webinar next week. And we anticipate that, as I said, I think that one will be related to recovery after Katrina and some of the lessons that they have to share with us. And after that, we'll go every other week, and it will focus on a theme. So if you have a theme or a particular issue you'd like us to address, please let us know. We did take a poll, and we'll probably do that again, but we did get a sense of the kind of things that you're interested in. So Len, I will turn this over to you for the poem and to sign us out. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. This week's poem is something I actually tripped across today. I think it was written back in the middle of March. It's called Choices by Langley Shazer. How do we react? As expected, as we've done traditionally, fulfilling our stereotype? Or can we treat this a golden opportunity to break the cycle, to change the course, to change perceptions of ourselves, for our futures? We now stand with a decision to be made. Let us make the right one. That just spoke to me, and I think also, connects to what Marian was saying about the tough choices they've made in Stanislaus and the opportunities that we have to address these systems that have been laid bare by the crisis. So thank you for your time and listening today, and we hope to see you back here next week. Thank you so much.